What's up guys, today on Dirt Lifestyle, we're gonna build a diff cover for my Sterling 10.5. There's always an argument of built versus bought, and today we're gonna explore both ideas. I got a pretty sweet front diff cover from Barnes 4-wheel drive for my Super Duty Dana 60. This cover is really a work of art. Unfortunately, they don't make one yet for the Sterling 10.5, so I decided this is a good opportunity to just make my own. If you spend much time off-road, you know that these thin stamped steel diff covers won't get you very far. I've actually seen people push these into the ring and pinion on the trail, and it's not pretty. This front diff cover that I got from Barnes 4-wheel drive does more than look good. It protects the ring and pinion, and of course our locker, and make sure we don't get stranded out in the middle of nowhere. We're gonna use this as inspiration to build the rear diff cover because I think that there's some design attributes that they use in this that are gonna make it a little bit easier for us to build our own. I've never actually built my own diff cover, but I can immediately identify the different potential problems that would come with a project like this. It's not going to be strength. Anybody can build a rock-proof diff cover. The problem is it needs to be finished with a watertight seal, so it needs to stay flat. Anytime you weld two pieces of material together, there's always a little bit of distortion. So the big hurdles that we're gonna have to cross today will be figuring out a way to build this in a way that keeps it flat enough to have a watertight seal and not pull or push or have too much distortion in a way that it's not gonna work whenever we're done with it.
Explain something.
To me, the easiest place to start when building our own diff cover is going to be the flange that mounts to the axle. We need to make sure this is flat. We need to make sure that all the holes are true, and it is. What I did is I just traced the existing diff cover. It was super easy. I used a transfer punch. I transferred down through all those holes, drilled the holes out. It was extremely, extremely easy. It's probably the easiest step of this entire thing. Now, if we look close at the Barnes cover, we're really lucky in this scenario because this is a cover that I haven't seen in this style before, and I'm really glad that it is. It's gonna be easier to mimic this because it's mostly a flat plate. If you look at it, they're building this in what I think is the easiest way to build something like this to keep it from warping. If you look at a lot of the other manufacturers out there, they have like a bunch of bends. Well, they have actually fewer bends than this, but they weld it all the way around, and that's gonna be really hard for us to replicate. But since this is mostly a flat plate, they literally just made accommodations for the ring gear and for the carrier. It's gonna make it so much easier to make the rear match the front. And I also think that this style is gonna be easier to pull off without having things warped. So we're definitely in luck to try and mimic this style. The next step is making accommodations for our ring gear, making accommodations for our carrier. We're gonna mark it out, drill some holes, use a plasma cutter to cut the inside of this out. As you can see, I've got this flange bolted down. Everything fits, everything's spinning freely, so we are ready for the next step. And the next step is gonna be building a guard for the ring gear. I wanna start there and then work our way down. So the piece that came out of here, I can't use because once you start to put bends in it, it's gonna be in too short. But I found a chunk of scrap that just, it just happens to be the right width. It's beautiful. So I'm gonna cut this down. I'm gonna go play with it on the press brake. And with the press brake, I'm gonna put a series of small bends and see if we can get this all done in one shot. It fits. So as you saw, I was just winging it. I went through and I used the angle finder just to make sure like these two bends are the same and these two bends are the same and so on and so forth, just to make sure that it had like a uniform looking radius, but I was completely winging it. It's, if I destroyed this piece, no big deal, I go grab something else from the scrap pile. But it worked fine. So if you don't have a press brake, that's fine. Before I had a press brake, I would just make cuts. You know, I'd cut most of the meat out, just have a little sliver on the backside of all this, and then I would manually bend everything. I'd, you know, tweak it a little bit in the vise here or there, and then I would just weld up the inside. But we have a press brake, so we don't have to do any of that. It saves us a couple extra steps. The next thing we need to build is another one of these radiuses for this side, another one of these radiuses for this side. I don't know if you can see in the camera, but I need to cover this bad boy up. It's gonna be much, much shorter because this almost fits in there as is. And then I need to make one for this other side as well. This is gonna be the same exact process. I'm just gonna cut a chunk of steel. I'm gonna make a short radius, put it all together. I've only got a few more pieces to fab up for this, and then we can start welding it together. And it's gonna be as simple as laying this on its side on a chunk of 1/4 inch, tracing it out, and cutting it out. Before we get to the hard part, let's take a look at our progress. I think this matches that front cover really well. Once it's all welded up and they're both painted, they're probably both gonna look like they're from the same manufacturer. I wanna take a second and talk about a couple things that I know I'm gonna get asked over and over and over. One is gonna be a fill hole. You'll notice there's a fill hole on the front cover. There's not one on the rear cover here, and there's not one on the OEM rear cover. The fill hole is on the front of this axle. It's on the housing, so we don't need to add one. The next thing is gonna be oil capacity. This is gonna lose a little bit, but it's barely gonna be any at all. If you look at the size and the depth of this rear cover, this thing is not a high capacity cover in any stretch of the imagination. So most of the oil is definitely gonna be held in the housing. If we lose any at all, it's gonna be like 1/2 quart or something like that, something that doesn't make a difference. I mean, this came from a 1-ton truck, and we're putting it on a Land Rover, so if it'll handle what you could do with it on a 1-ton truck, it'll definitely handle whatever we do to it with a Land Rover. The last thing that we need to do is weld this bad boy up, and then of course clean it up. And welding it up is gonna be the hardest part of this entire thing, because we're gonna try to get it not to warp. What my plan is to fully weld everything that is on the outside of this cover first, and I'm just gonna leave it attached to this flange basically with a whole bunch of little welds here and there, just little spot welds. And the reason I want to do that is if there's any stretching or anything that would be enough pressure to distort this flange, it would break one of these tiny little welds first. Like I'm saying, I'm gonna do this whole outside piece first, and then if anything cracks or pops, I know that that was basically a fuse, and it's not gonna have enough strength to warp what's on here. Hard to see in the camera, but that is sitting perfectly flat on there. It looks great. The only issue that I had was I had to clearance the sides right here to accommodate. We were contacting just a little bit right there from the weld. So I'm gonna put this up on the table and let's talk about the process. We started this video with a couple objectives in mind. One was to make the rear look like the front. I definitely think that we did that. Once we paint these, they're gonna look like they came from the same company. The only difference really between the two now is this sweet little beefed up flange they put on the bottom, because that's gonna rub into rocks, and it's to protect the hardware. I would need to go buy some hardware to make that, and so in the future, I might do that. I might add that, and it'll be a good idea. But other than that, I think that they're both look very, very similar. The second goal was to keep things flat, and you can push on these covers, and nothing's rocking, which means that it's a flat mounting surface. I'm very pleased with the fact that it turned out that way, and that was because of the process we used. You know, I did use really long welds, which everybody says not to do, but because of the process that we used, we didn't have to worry about the fact that there was long welds. Also, I combined MIG welding with TIG welding, so I MIG'd this whole top piece first with just a couple tacks hanging it on. There was enough distortion and shrinking and expanding to break a couple of those tacks, so I'm glad I did it that way. And then I went through, I MIG welded the whole inside, then I bolted this onto the axle, and I made all these welds here continuous, because I think continuous welds are going to be much more likely to combat any sort of leaking. And then I flipped it over and I finished out all of these inside welds around the edge here, all with a TIG welder. Now, I have a theory that TIG welding has less shrinking and expanding than MIG welding, and so since this wasn't bolted to anything, I wanted to make sure we still didn't have any distortion, so that's why I decided to TIG weld around this entire edge. And then anything that looks suspect, I'm gonna go back through, and anything that looks like it could be a leaker, I'm just gonna fire up that TIG torch and work my way over it. So I think all in all, this is really a successful build. This cost me no dollars, because this was all scrap that was laying around my shop. I build so much that I have a lot of extra scrap. I would say that if you're comparing on built versus bought, there's a whole bunch of different things you need to think about. I mean, when you buy it, you know that you can bolt it on and it's all good to go. When you build it, I mean, who knows? I might have a leak that I have to combat in the future and pull it back off. I mean, there's way more troubleshooting, there's way more skill involved, and all these things that comes into play whenever you build it yourself. Now, there's also extra fun, there's a lot of learning, there's things like that that comes with building it yourself, but sometimes, you know, it just pays to just buy something that you can have faith in, that you can bolt on and not have to worry about ever again. Whatever you choose is completely up to you. I like to do a combination of both, obviously. I hope you guys enjoyed the video. This is part of a series where I'm swapping 1-ton axles into my Land Rover Discovery. If you're into that kind of thing, make sure you like the video, subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. If you want to help support the channel, you can go to thedirtlifestyle.com. We've got t-shirts, hats, stickers, all kinds of stuff like that. We also have a link to our Patreon account, and I'm starting to release special content for our Patreon subscribers because I really appreciate your guys' support. If you want to follow me on social media, I'm @DirtLifestyleNate. We'll see you next time.